All right, so now let's take a look at the command economies of socialism and communism. How do they address the three economics questions? So first, let's take a look at the question of what to produce. How does the command economy, socialism, communism, how do they answer the question of what to produce? Well, let's look at a communist economy. A communist economy, when it would come to what to produce, is pretty much determined by the government. It is determined by the leaders in the government. And they would basically make like a 5-year plan saying what to produce. And in this 5-year plan, let's just take any like product we would think of, whether it be steel, whether it would be shoes. They would say, we're going to make a 5-year plan that we're going to produce this number of shoes for our society. Now, it would actually be a pretty hard job to do to be able to, predict how many shoes you would need for a society. Remember, there's no individual shoe companies or businesses in this society. So it would be all government made, where they'd be thinking, the average person needs 1 pair of sports shoes and 1 pair of dress shoes. So we're going to make, if we have 10 million people, 10 million dress shoes, 10 million sports shoes. How many of you would be happy with that? Just not to be too stereotypical, but girls, how many of you would be happy having 1 pair of shoes? Well, how many pairs of shoes does the average person need? Is it 1 pair of dress shoes? Is it 2? Is it 3? Do I need a brown? Do I need a black? Do I need, different colors? I know for my wife, she has more shoes than I do. So even between us two, we have different numbers. So it's really hard to predict how much of a product you'll need for your society, for distribution. So it's hard to make these 5-year plans that come out the numbers of how much they'll need. Sometimes there's a surplus, too many, and sometimes there are shortages or not enough. So that's the question of what to produce. They answer the question of what to produce. It's done by government agencies where they make decisions on what to produce. Now, when we get to the how to produce it, many times they would have these, again, the 5-year plans for the what to produce. Then for how to produce it, they would issue a 3-year plan and saying how these goals are being met. So maybe if it was the former Soviet Union, they would have a big shoe factory in Moscow. They would have 5 other shoe factories all across the country where people would work making shoes for everyone. So they would decide where to put them, how to put them, how many shoe factories we want, where they're going to go, who's going to work in them. This would be the how. And again, it's the government that would make the decision of how to make it. If it's going to be steel, they would decide, how the steel factories, where are we going to put them, how are they going to be made, how many people are going to work in them. So the government answers both what to produce and how to produce. When it gets to our third question, for whom, the government again answers the question for whom, whether it is trying to pretty much be what we'd call the central planners. I mentioned before, but the central planners pretty much make all the decisions in these economies. So the central planners would decide for whom gets it. Now, that would mean, are they distributed equally in markets? Are there some people who get them first? Often what happened in the command economies would be the people who were either in the party or who were kind of had more privileges, who were more in that central planning area. They would get things first. So if you worked for the government and you rose up, you often got things before anybody else. So command economies, what they're really good at is effectively making a lot of things. They're extremely effective. They can make things quickly if they need to, because you don't have to, wait for different businesses to come up. You don't have to wait for businesses to fail. So if you need a lot of things done, they can make it very quick. If a road needs to be made, that road will be made and it's going to be there. Now, is it the most, the best place for a road? Who knows? Are they going to have the best numbers? Who knows? But if it needs to be made, it needs to be made quickly. Command economies are very good at getting things done and getting things done quickly. They can make things quickly because, again, they don't have to wait for a business cycle, which is what you have to wait for in a market economy. You have to wait for small businesses to make it. Some make it, some don't. However, we'll get to the impact of the command economies right now. So command economies, if you look at their records, that have not been good. Communism, for the most part, has not worked very well. If we take some examples, we can look at North Korea is a communist country right now. And what's happened in North Korea is there's starvation, mass starvation of the people. And the biggest problem is that the government, the people in charge, they have all they want. So if you're in the party, if you're one of the top people in the government, you can get things. You have connections. However, the average people, it's been horrible. There's not enough food made. There's not enough food. There's shortages. And it's not just North Korea where we saw this happen. In the former Soviet Union, which was Russia, and it's actually 15 modern-day countries. It's a huge, massive. It was a massive country. It was the largest in the world. What you saw in the Soviet Union is there was shortages. And there were shortages because there were errors in the central planning. The planners did not understand what the people needed. Again, let's take the shoe example. If the central planners are going to decide how many shoes are made, well, what if they're off? There might be a total surplus of shoes. Or there might not be enough. There might not be shoes for people. Then what happens is the black market starts playing in on this quite a bit. Like let's say the government just didn't make enough shoes and people want more. What will happen is people will go to the market and they'll buy the shoes as quickly as they can and they will sell them on the black market because they're scarce. And when scarcity happens, prices go up. Let me give another real example of what can happen in a command economy. So, what happened in the former Soviet Union was that there were light bulbs. And what they decided was that if a factory needs a light bulb, they'll replace it right away because that's a factory, it's for the people to work. But for in homes, if you need a light bulb, that, those you could wait for. You don't need a light bulb right away. Your house doesn't have to be totally lit. If one or two go out, it's not the end of the world. But they made the decision that factories needed light bulbs right away. So people catch on to these things pretty quick. So what actually happened was the factory workers, what they would do is they would, when no one was looking, they would steal light bulbs in the factory and they would sell them to people in their homes for a high price. Because they knew they could just steal more and the factory ones would be replaced automatically. It became very inefficient. We had a black market set up. And there's lots of black markets in command economies because generally a government, central planners, cannot plan for all the goods that will be needed. There will be shortages of some goods. There will be surpluses of other goods. So a general problem what happens in a lot of command economies is if there's not enough bread, people will wait in line for bread if they don't make enough. And another huge problem with this would be pay. People who are working in these factories know that they're going to have a job in a command economy. In communism, it is, the government will find a job for you. You will have a job. It's really hard to get fired because it's supposed to be the workers' paradise where everyone's supposed to be able to work. So what happens is if people know that they're not going to go up in salary very much, they're not going to go down in salary very much, and they're going to be employed. Do they have the incentive to work hard? A lot of it's no. So you end up getting a lot of crappy products being made that people don't really want. There weren't that many good innovations and products coming out of Soviet countries or communist countries. There just weren't. Because no one outside of the Soviet Union wants to buy a Russian car unless they just really want a cheap car that's going to fall apart quite a bit because they don't have that good of a reputation. Even today they really don't, but not in the Soviet times at all. So, let me explain one more story real quickly. This is when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is a former Soviet Union republic. It's now an independent country, but it still has a lot of Soviet policies that go on even to this day. When I was there, this was 10, 12 years ago. Things are different now. But when I was there, there was planes that would fly in the country. There were 5 airports in the country, and you could fly from one city to another. Well, you had a choice. You could either, where I lived, there's a city called Kornigench. Now, you had a choice if you lived in Kornigench. It was in the northern part of the country. And if you wanted to get to the capital of Ashgabat, you would have to go through a desert. Now, you could take a large van, which would take you through there, and that would cost you would be 100,000 manat. 100,000 manat is equivalent to, back then it was about $4. A lot of inflation in this country too. So, you could take 100,000 to 120,000 manat and take a ride through the desert, which would take anywhere from 8 to 12 hours, depending on the road conditions, if you stop to eat, and you could do that. Or, you could take a plane. Go to the nearby city of Daşagüz, get on the airport, and take a plane, which would get you there in 45 minutes. Now, what should the cost be of the plane compared to the van ride? What would you think? You logically think the plane must be much more expensive. It's much more convenient. It's a plane. That's probably going to cost you, what, 500,000 manat, a million manat? No, it costs 25,000 manat. The government put a price at 25,000 manat per plane ticket to go from Daşagüz to Ashgabat. So it's cheaper, and it also takes a lot less time. And you're not driving through a desert, which is the most pleasant thing to do. So, especially a lot of these vans didn't have very good air, there was no air conditioning pretty much. So, what do you think people did when these plane tickets came up? They bought them quickly as possible, and often they were sold for more money to someone else. There was corruption in the system. Another thing happened too was they decided that we need this to be a fair system for everybody. So what we'll do is you have to buy plane tickets 15 days before you fly. So 15 days before you'll buy your plane ticket and you can fly. So 15 days before your flight, what do you think it was like at the place where you had to buy your airplane tickets? It was insane. There were 50-year-old ladies pushing, throwing elbows, trying to get the first in that line. Once they opened up, there was no line. People just pushed their way. It was pushing, fighting to get that ticket. It was hard to get one. Unless you knew someone who worked for the airplane place, and then you would talk to them, you maybe give them some money beforehand, and you would bribe your way. And bribes happened all the time when I was in Turkmenistan. Bribes were epidemic in this system because to get something that there's a shortage of, you would have to bribe to get it. So people could get some things, but they have to bribe. But truth be told, it still wasn't as good as the products you'd get in most market economies. Here's another impact of command economies we see here, or the communism. Here we have South Korea. Here we have Japan. And here we have North Korea. Here you see with the lines there. Almost no lights, almost no development. And here you have China, and you might say, but Mr. Wood, China's a communist country. Well, this is Southeast China, where they've done a lot of special economic zones where they're pretty much allowing capitalism to happen. Well, North Korea, what's happened? There's almost no development going on there. The people in charge, the command economy, Kim Jong-il, other people in charge, they get all the goods they want. The people, the central planners, but the common people are starving. And this does happen in quite a few communist countries. Now, North Korea is definitely is a very far communist country. It's probably about the worst one you could live in. But if you take a list of the communist countries and their economies, they're not that good. You have, Korea, Vietnam, China. But China's changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years. You can barely even call it a communist country anymore. You have Cuba. Now, Cuba's probably the success story. And it's still people, refugees come to the United States all the time from Cuba. So when we look at this, the command economies, we say the impact is, I would again say that these are not working.